Dungan, how are you? Thanks for checking back in. Episode 19, I think. It's going to be a good one. This is my third week in a row back in America. Third week in a row that I have not had a job out of the country. It's a little streak I'm working on. Doesn't take much work. The old streak was like, I don't know, thousands of weeks in a row. I have no idea. Feels good. Mental health game, pretty good. Gotta tell you, doing my meditating. I start meditating an hour a day now. I heard a guy said he'd do it. I'm like, all right, I'll do it. It's weird. It's the places your brain goes when you're not using it. I can't describe it any better than that. Speaking of the brain, this week, an amazing guest. This guy, another job I didn't know existed. His name is Jared Tendler. He is a mental game coach. He helps high-performing individuals in sports and stock trading and World Series of Poker, that sort of thing. He helps them take emotion out of their decision-making and out of their performance. It's stunning. It's a really stunning thing what this guy does, and he's helped a lot of people. And he talks about his process. He's really sharp. It was great talking to him. And at the end, when I said I could go on for hours, I meant it. I could talk to this guy for hours. There's so much cool stuff here. But it's condensed into a half hour. So get your favorite caffeinated beverage and pay attention because it goes by like that.
Jared Tendler, thank you so much for your time, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Joe. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. I heard you on another podcast, and I'm going, I didn't even know this was a thing. And you've made a career out of it. So let's get right to it. We'll start at the beginning. Where are you from originally?
Connecticut.
Connecticut. And you're living where now?
In Bucks County, PA.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
slight migration.
oh, sure. You know, I mean, to Californians, that's all the Northeast. So,
right. Exactly.
And what I kept, a friend of mine asked me, sounds interesting. What does he do? And I kind of went, well, he coaches people. I didn't quite know how to phrase it. And rather than destroy it, I will let you do it. What exactly is your title and how would you elevator pitch what you do for people?
Yeah. So I'm a mental game coach, which basically means for most of my professionals that I work with, I'm removing the emotion that affects their decision-making or their execution or their performance. So you think about anger, you think about fear, you think about confidence issues, you think about motivational issues. And sometimes it extends to things in their training and practice as well, right? Because if you train poorly, then you're going to obviously play poorly. But the clientele that I work with are typically golfers, poker players, traders. For a time, it was esports professionals. But then there's sort of a random mix of others. I've worked with entrepreneurs, worked with one of the top pool players in the world. I work with some sports bettors, some MMA fighters. I recently worked with a radiologist. So at the end of the day, right, we all can do some pretty dumb things when our emotions get in the way. And so if you can understand the origin of them without necessarily getting into mommy and daddy issues, right, we can kind of deal in this layer of what I call performance flaws, where your perception of yourself, the competitive environment, or just sort of your opponents is just fundamentally flawed. You just have kind of bad logic running in the background, running this sort of software that just creates emotion and then makes you do dumb things.
Fascinating. And I want to get into the nuts and bolts of that, but I want to get to how you got good at this. So did you study, were you an athlete when you were younger? Were you in the mental health field from the start? How did you get into this?
Yeah, no, I consider myself more of an athlete than mental health. I played tennis when I was growing up, and baseball and basketball, and would play basically whatever I could as a kid. Freshman year of high school at 4'11", maybe 90 pounds, I realized my aspirations as a professional athlete were quite limited. So I chose golf for obvious reasons, and kind of got good very quickly, played golf in college. I was a 3-time All-American at Skidmore Division III, but, I won 9 tournaments, was competing for national championships. I mean, relatively high level, and still, was still getting better, right? So my aspirations of playing professionally sort of were still on the table. However, here's the big asterisk. Trying to qualify for the US Open in 1997, I played some of the best golf of my life, but my putting, I basically, so that was my first indication that the mind kind of mattered. And it really didn't kind of become a problem because it's like, it happens once. It's like, all right, so it's one off. You don't really think much of it. But then it kind of keeps happening. And you're like, all right, well, now I got to do something about this. So at the time, this is, late 90s, sports psychology, golf psychology, still fairly in its infancy. I mean, it's somewhat ubiquitous among some circles, but it's not mainstream by any means. So the material that was out there helped, but not when it mattered most. So I would get better under normal levels of pressure, but push comes to shove, I kept choking. So I sort of reasoned, all right, well, they're kind of thinking a little bit too behaviorally, right? All right, you're feeling too much pressure. We're going to teach you to relax. You're not really confident. We'll teach you how to be confident. It's kind of this like black and white thing. It didn't work for me. And I kind of reasoned, all right, well, I can't be alone in this, right? There has to be other people that were kind of naturally selected out of this competitive landscape because you couldn't have the chops. And so look, maybe I can figure out like kind of what's at the root of this. And if I do, I can either have a professional golf career or I'd have a career as a coach. So I did not pursue professional golf when I graduated college. I actually added a psychology major to my business degree and then went to Northeastern for my master's program in counseling psychology. So I spent 2 years doing that and then 2 years getting licensed as a therapist, never with the intent to practice. It was all about taking that kind of training, combining it with, my understanding of golf and sports psychology and kind of creating this sort of hybrid program that would go deeper into these issues without necessarily getting personal.
And and as you say, this was kind of in its infancy. So you were sort of the Lewis and Clark of this arena. Is that a fair statement, or was there?
That's a little too generous. I mean, right. We go back to the '60s and sports psychology was a thing. Think like the Romanian deadlifting squad. Obviously the WSOP was building up some credentialing within sports psychology, and it was coming out of the military, and so it was growing, but we're still kind of very niche. Late 90s, there are professionals. I mean, there are people in baseball and tennis and golf that are there, right? But, there's still only kind of handfuls of these people. So yeah, I wouldn't say I was Lewis and Clark. I'd probably say I was like, the third or fourth wagon, expedition kind of behind it.
But still one of the early pioneers of this. And it's a really fascinating world. So how did you start connecting with clients? Did you just meet and greet people, or did word spread about you and they started coming to you? How did that unfold?
Yeah. So I once I got my license, I was living in Boston at the time. I quit my job and moved out to Arizona, just Golf Central out there. It was literally 120 golf courses within like a 20-mile square area. I was like, okay. So, but I would just started kind of cold calling golf shops and professionals and trying to find a home. I found a home. And then, it was just kind of, just a lot of, groundwork to put myself out there and, create some kind of clientele. And it took a little bit longer than I expected. I mean, I was definitely a little overconfident when it came to, how quickly it would kind of get off the ground. Because to me, for years, all I heard was golf is such a mental game. But then, you ask people to put their money where their mouth is, and all of a sudden everybody gets a little tight-lipped.
Yeah.
So it took a little bit more to kind of get things ramped up in golf. And I found, I worked with some professionals. I worked with a gal who won on the LPGA tour. It was like things were growing. I got a kid who's, on the doorstep to the PGA tour, who I started working with when he was 10, which is super cool. But I just had a hard time finding some real traction. Ironically, mutual friends kind of met up at a golf course in Oregon. And one of the guys that were there was a professional online poker player. This was 2007. Now, online poker at that time was really starting to boom, as a lot of things online were. And so he was making around $20,000 to $30,000 a month playing online poker. However, he had what are called tilt issues, right? And so tilt is just a really fun way of describing an anger problem. Okay. And I genuinely believe this. I think a lot more people would go to anger management if it was called tilt management or something. I mean, because basically tilt is you get so pissed off that you do a bunch of dumb things, right? And it comes from from pinball, where you would quite literally tilt the machine in your favor when you get pissed off. Anyway, so his tilt issues was so large that he was literally ripping out his desktop computer and smashing it in the wall, breaking his monitor, breaking mice. And again, all of this is because in poker, as the superior player, you're playing up against very weaker players. I'm not exaggerating. It's the equivalent of the New York Yankees playing up against a Pee Wee team every day, except that Pee Wee team beats the Yankees and your mind goes boom,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it can't reconcile that gap. And so that was his difficulty. So we kind of got to talking. A couple months later, we ended up doing some coaching. 4 months after that, the beginning of 2018, he had won $600,000 in those 4 months. So a lot of success, and that basically just kind of opened up this whole world of online poker. And I was able to kind of create the industry at that point.
Now, can
So
you?
then it was easy to find clients.
Oh, yeah, sure. Let's talk about a testimonial. If you can
Right.
say, I made $600,000 thanks to working with Jared, of course. Now, can you talk for a minute about, is it some of the same mechanisms in golfers that you find in poker players, or is it a completely different thing trying to coach one or the other?
I mean, the difference is, like, it took me a little while to understand the world of online poker. I mean, I played poker as a kid, but when we're talking about the psychological mechanisms, it's all the same. I mean, we are people first, and then we do stuff, right? Like poker or golf or trading, whatever. So you kind of need to understand the environment to understand how that person's mind and the mechanisms of competition sort of unfold, so that I can know how to be influential, and I can understand specifically where these sort of points of failure are occurring. But at the end of the day, right, if we're talking about, for example, an illusion of control, or high expectations, or an expectation that you would make money every day, or as a golfer, the expectation that you'd make every 5-footer, even though the top tour players in the world only make around 92% of them, roughly, right? So, those types of flaws create the emotional reactions that we're talking about. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's all the same stuff. It's just the nuances sort of differ.
You see, now this goes back to something you said about how they would be doing something for years and then they'd reach a certain level and then mistakes would start showing up because maybe they were training wrong, which to
Yeah,
me
100%.
is fascinating because, and how sinister, how tricky it is in the mind, because here you are, you're getting the results, so you think you're doing everything right, and then you reach a certain level and then the flaws start to appear, and that must just drive some of these people crazy because this was working before and now it's not. So are you able to point out, say, look, now that you're at this level, that's why these things are happening? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I've got a PGA Tour player who I'm going to be talking with and we were just having a conversation about this exact same thing. Like he may, even within my work, that's why I like the term mental game, right? I know there's like, you might hear performance coach or mindset coach or mental coach. To me, this sucker is a game. And because there's an ever evolving strategy, there's an ever evolving, you do not get to solve this thing. You will never be perfect. Actually, maybe you will when you're dead, right? We don't know what happens afterwards, but let's assume it's all perfection then.
Right.
Until that point, you will always have psychological, tactical, technical, knowledge-based weaknesses because we can't achieve perfection. So the guy I'm talking about, right? We did a lot of work. His confidence is no longer an issue. And now he's sort of graduated to anger and motivational issues. And that often happens, right? When your confidence gets stronger, you believe in yourself, and now you can invariably start to expect more of yourself. And then if you don't get the results, sometimes your motivation can lag, or you start to expect too much of yourself, and you're not putting in the work because your expectations are sort of assuming that you're already there. So again, it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole or a Rubik's Cube that just kind of keeps unfolding.
Do you find that when you help these people, not only does their golf game or their poker game improve, but their mental state becomes better in general in life, and maybe their relationships improve and their sleep improves and things like that?
It does, yeah, it's 100%. I mean, it doesn't happen to everybody, but certainly, I mean, those are always the most gratifying, testimonials from people who've read my books, and they say it's like, yeah, this is great. I'm making more money at poker or elsewhere, but my wife is not going to leave me anymore.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now, I want to get back to something else you said about finding the instances. For example, when you're working with a poker player, you're finding the moments where he or she drops the ball, where they make the bad bet, where they think they're going to win and they eat it, where the Little League team beats the Yankees. Is there a pattern that emerges as you find these flawed moments and you say, okay, I'm now, because of this pattern, I can see the mechanism? Is that how that generally works?
It does, yeah. In fact, actually, I call it kind of either mapping or profiling these issues, and that's the good thing about them, is that they do happen in recurring cycles and patterns. And so, what I would say to anybody who actually wants to begin doing this work, look specifically at all the times when you were weak, failed, emotional, things were really bad. It's super easy to kind of want to escape that discomfort, that pain, that turmoil, whatever, or just like not being happy with where you're at, and wanting to escape it. The problem is if you just escape it, you kind of lose all the data for why you sort of slipped into that. And you can say, okay, well, maybe the circumstances were part of it. But when it happens again and again, it's not circumstances, there's something sort of off. So the goal is to really kind of dig deep into those moments and identify the specific thought patterns that are kind of occurring, right? And so you'll hear people with a lot of fear or anxiety, like, well, their minds will be kind of consumed with overthinking or second guessing or doubts. And we want to actually capture the specific things that you are questioning, the specific doubts that you have, the specific things that you're overthinking, because they become very indicative of like what those underlying flaws are. When we're dealing with fear or anxiety, we're really just talking about uncertainty, right? The antidote to fear or anxiety is certainty. You do not have fear when you have certainty. Now, what happens is you have these performance flaws, right? High expectations or illusions of control, for example, that take that uncertainty and make it something that's bad, right? Now, oh, I shouldn't have doubts here. I'm supposed to know this. Like, well, and then something's wrong. And so then it kind of snowballs, right? If you map all of that, it gives you a little bit of clarity, on what you're dealing with, which you can then use to kind of start to debug and understand those flaws. But B, you can catch it early. If there's anything that your listeners can take away from my speaking today, it's this. The emotional system has the power to shut down higher brain function.
Say that again.
The emotional system has the power to shut down higher brain function. Higher brain functions include thinking, decision-making, and guess what? Emotional control. So the part of the brain responsible for controlling emotion can get shut down by emotion. So you become like this person standing at the edge of a beach trying to hold up a wave, right? You're going to get consumed by your emotions if they get too high. So if we're talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, or we're talking about any attempts to try to contain your emotions in the short term, you have to catch it early. What happens for most people is they're not aware of the early signs of the escalation of their emotions, and they get too big, and you don't have the ability to control yourself at that point, right? You can't translate thought into action. So you do a bunch of dumb things, especially in conditions of competition, but certainly in relationships as well. So if you can catch it early, then that's where you can be most effective, because your mind still has the capacity to kind of fight against that rising tide of emotion. If you wait until it's too late, you'll be in the state where you're either just like kind of in a blind rage or a blind panic, right? You have no thinking whatsoever, or almost like the worst place to be is in this middle zone where you're aware of what you're doing. You're aware that what you're doing is wrong, and yet you can't stop yourself. And then there's a lot of self-blame. But the reality is it has nothing to do with your intelligence. It has nothing to do with you. It has to do with your timing, and your timing sucks. And it's a really big problem.
Wow. That's kind of heavy, man. Like, and finding those moments, I mean, that's hard, because when you're in that emotional turmoil, you're already off to step 3, 4, and 5 because of the wiring of the brain. Is it because I've been studying a guy lately named Joe Dispenza, who talks about the neuroplasticity of the brain and how you can sort of unwire your brain so you don't leap to rage. You can step it back and undo those synaptic connections. Is that what happens when you work with somebody? Do you slowly unwire certain circuitry so that they can think a different series of thoughts?
Yes and no, and it depends.
Okay.
So when you build more awareness, you build new connections, right? You start to see data and detail that you didn't see before. And to me, that's the most essential piece, right? So anybody can start right now and start to kind of detail or map, right? Profile out where those patterns exist. And then they can start kind of looking backwards at what's happening before that and see the early warning signs. Sometimes overconfidence is the preceder to anger. Just saying, you just have to kind of, so in there we're kind of building new connections. Then when we find like these underlying flaws and we're trying to actually correct them, we are not unlearning. I think unlearning, now neurologically, I'm not certain what happens here. So I'm going to kind of put off my, neuropsychologist hat for a second. But to me, unlearning is not the right mentality, because it's kind of like completing a complicated maze. You want to know that you took a wrong turn here. You want to just sort of master the fact that you're just never going to take that turn again, right? So it's more about kind of upgrading. I think of it more of like software that just kind of gets continually upgraded with little patches, right? You kind of fix the code, you fix the faulty code. And if you do that, then you automatically will react differently. If I can correct your illusion of control, right, then you're never going to overreact when you get bad luck, because now you understand that, oh, okay, well, there are factors that are beyond my control, so it's cool, right? I'm going to keep focusing on the things that I have firm control of. There's a third piece, and we're going to loosely call it trauma. So you have people, and I'm not going to make assumptions about you, but certainly for me, right? In my childhood, I grew up, middle class, 2 parents, very kind of stable. I was lucky to have a very stable household. And yet, right, there were still things that for me were emotionally traumatizing. Okay. I had a beautiful Agassi mullet as a kid. I played tennis, right? And before my bar mitzvah, my dad wanted to chop my Agassi mullet off. Okay. So exactly. So here I am trying to become a man, right? And you're taking away my manhood. So anyway, but again, this is not like a significant life event for relative to most people, but it's again, relative to me, it affected my ability to make decisions for myself in my early 20s. I had to work through that emotion, right? So the trauma just means that there's emotion frozen. And so, I feel more nervous, or I feel certain emotions that are old that flood my system today, right? I think we all have some elements of this, and you can, it's super common. The easiest way you can identify it is if, when you think back to that past event, if you feel emotion and this thing has happened more than 6 months to a year ago, okay, it is trauma, right? It might be a small little tight, this is not like combat, right? Where you're getting shot out and, your teammates or colleagues died, right? This is relative to us in this insulated world. We will experience trauma. Now, recognizing that stuff and releasing it, healing it, correcting it is kind of like an injury to the body, right? Scar tissue builds up. You got to work through it. So the neuroplasticity there, I think, is more about kind of unlocking certain facets of the brain and being able for the resolution and healing to occur than it is about necessarily like rewiring certain facets. But sometimes what will happen is, let's say we heal the trauma, and then you sort of have capacity freed up. So now all of a sudden my range of motion in my shoulder is freed up, but yet I still can't swing the golf club the way I want. But now I can train it the way I want. Before, I couldn't even get my arm in the right place because this swing was too locked up. So emotionally, we have the same kind of thing.
Whoa, that's, I'm thinking this has probably happened with athletes for centuries and they just didn't know it. Now
Totally.
we're slowly unlocking it. For example, I remember some baseball players would get something called the yips.
Yeah.
These very, very bizarre and arbitrary things out of the blue. Kent Mercker was one of the premier closers in baseball for the Braves. And then one day he couldn't find the strike zone. And his career was over in days because he just started walking everybody. Steve Sachs was a pro second baseman for years. All of a sudden, he would get these fat ground balls right to him. He would stand, plant his feet, look at the first baseman, and he'd throw it into the seats. I mean, it was just the weirdest thing. And my question is, why now? Why is it, after years of doing this so well, why now does it suddenly manifest itself?
I mean, it can happen for a lot of reasons. I mean, so sometimes you're at the tail end of your career. You have built up all of these kind of mini failures. And now you're thinking about, all right, well, I don't want to end my career like this. I don't want, it's like this sort of subtle doubt starts to creep in, at kind of the tail end. Sometimes it's just like the buildup of failure gets to a point where it just kind of breaks. It's like the dam just kind of busts open. Sometimes you're so competent, your expectations get so outsized. Sometimes it's because you've had so much success and you've kind of reached all your goals. You sort of like lose sight of what you're actually trying to do anymore, or accomplish. And so your focus kind of drops. You have a couple of failures and they're so shocking to your system that you then kind of start to fear it. And then it starts to happen and it just kind of snowballs and gets worse.
wild. It's wild. And to your point about catching it early, I mean, that makes a lot of sense now because
Yeah.
I mean, I've had those things where, I mean, I've been in therapy, all of a sudden I'm unhappy in life and going, well, wait a minute. I was coasting along in this mediocre life just fine. All of a sudden I'm unhappy. And I guess it's just how the brain works. You're right. It's a sort of assembly of things. And all of a sudden it
Well,
spills over the lip of the cup and you start getting unhappy.
I mean, some of it is when you reach a level of success, when you reach a level of stability, that stuff kind of has the chance to come out. Like you can't, as a combat soldier, you can't process trauma when you're still at war. So for us, right, the equivalent of is, you can't kind of process trauma when you're still kind of not psychologically strong enough. And that can mean a lot of different things for different people. But that is often what happens. It's like you're sort of strong enough to be weak.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah. And it's also get the ego out of the way, admit that this thing is, hamstringing you, and then go from there. One last question. Because you were talking about how anger gets in the way. There are some people on television who seem to perform well angry. For example, in the world of poker, there's a fellow named Phil Hellmuth who doesn't have table manners. Let's just put it that way. He seems
Sure.
awfully angry. And I know you don't know the man. I know you've never trained the man, but I'm just wondering, can you explain how people like him, and Conor McGregor is another one who seems awfully brash and talkative, and yet they seem to be at the top of their game. And I'm just wondering if there's if you can explain that, or you're just like, or maybe it's a false self that they have going. I don't know.
So there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law. It's from 1908. Okay, so if you can kind of imagine this sort of graph, right, with this like kind of the upside down U-shaped. Okay, so here's performance. Here is sort of emotional level or stress level. Okay, as your emotions or intensity rises, your performance rises, right? And this should make sense. When you're bored or distracted or tired, you suck.
Yeah.
Okay. So as your intensity level rises, right, you kind of hit this perfect point where everything kind of comes together and your emotional state for you, your mental state for you is optimal. Okay. Some people need anger to get to that peak.
Okay.
Right. Other people, it keeps going, right?
Okay.
And as your emotions keep rising, now your performance is dropping to the point where it can get to zero. So what you're looking for, like the optimal level of performance for you, is like finding that right emotional state. And for some people, they are better when they're angry or they're pissed off.
Wow, that's another wrinkle in this also, because they would see what you do and they're like, nope, I'm good. Because that's fascinating that they would know. I mean, assuming this law applies to them, they somehow intuitively know I got to get there, and it works for them. So good on them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of athletes, I mean, everybody's just kind of figuring out for themselves like how they best perform, and then they just sort of trial and error figured it out.
Yeah, and it's also individualized too. A fascinating world. Tell everybody where they can find you and how to reach you, and about your book as well.
Yeah, JaredTendler.com. If you're on Twitter, I'm pretty active there at Jared Tendler. All my books, the Mental Game of Poker 1 and 2, and the recently released Mental Game of Trading. You get information on my website, but they're pretty much wherever you buy books in audiobook, ebook, and softcover.
And we talk, so I could talk about this for hours. I just think this is a really fascinating world. I thank you for your time. I know you got to bail. Take care, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. It's a lot of fun.
Fascinating, right? Do you see why I meant when I said I could have gone on for hours about this? It's such a wild world. And you start to wonder, like, what sort of things in our lives have we messed up just because we got a little too angry or a little too impulsive, or should, that word should. This should happen this way. This should happen that way. No, none of it should. It is. It just is. Everything that happened is now over, so there's no point getting upset about it. If you need to grieve or something, do that. That's normal. But after a while, you can't let this dominate your decision making. So, be aware of how you are performing. Whether, even if you're not, you don't have to be a PGA golfer with millions of dollars at stake. You can just be you. And you're just living your life going, okay, is anger making me go to the store right now and buy too many Pop-Tarts or whatever? No, I don't know. That's for you to decide. But the important thing is to be aware of it. I hope you got a lot out of this interview. I did. Just going back and rewatching it, I thought, whoa, I forgot about that part. I forgot about that part. that applies to my life. I can apply that there, and I can apply that there, and I can put that on the shelf over there, and this will influence a lot of my decision making in life. Hopefully some better decisions. For example, this intro and outro for this episode, I am filming in my bathroom. I'm not trying to be gross. I'm just trying something different. And I don't think emotions got in the way of this decision. I just thought, well, this is kind of a splashy background. I'll just do this here. I may regret it later,